Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Father Dimitri, for inviting me again, giving me the opportunity to speak. And thank you for whatever we can do with the visuals. It's always nice. We're going to be talking about a little bit of history about the Russian Orthodox Church. And history, of course, am I too loud, Father? Is this a little... Do you think it's good?
No, it's not too loud, but it sounds like very bassy.
It's very bassy.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Now go ahead.
Okay. So, and now it's too much the other way. I sound like I'm...
I'm surprised.
Yeah,
12 years old.
Where to begin? I teach the social ethics class, you all know, at Holy Cross, and over the years I've come up with this, just hit upon this idea that, for example, when we talk about the social ethics of care for the poor, and we look at the medical care for the poor, and we read a beautiful book about how the Christians in the 300s invented the hospital. They literally invented it. But we read that book against this great story of our local Boston hero, Dr. Paul Farmer, who went to Haiti in early 1980s and also built a hospital and a healthcare system from scratch in the poorest province of the poorest country of the Western Hemisphere. So when we look at history, it just enlightens what we're doing today. And then likewise, when we read about war in the social ethics class, where we study about it, we read a book called The Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire, so we can see how they dealt with it. We have 2,000 years of history in our faith to draw on. And there's so many lessons to be taken from it that one mind can't comprehend them all. I mean, therefore, we will repeat many mistakes. But that's probably as it should be. Christ said, "My kingdom is not of this world." But to the extent that we can read history and see where we came from and what sort of struggles that we face, the church has always faced, or the Christian people have always faced, it's very educational. An example recently is I saw this in the newspaper, someone was in Sweden, and the fellow was saying, Muslim immigrants, it's impossible. These people are only committed to violence. And the person speaking to the Swede started laughing because all he could think of was the centuries in which the Swedes and the Vikings were synonymous with, irreformable violence. So how history goes, and tides change and things shift, and nothing is fixed in a way, and everything is in constant movement. And the crosses that we bear and the struggles that we have, Christians have faced before, and the dilemmas that we have and the confusions that we have, and the Christians have faced before. On Sunday in the Grammy Awards, Queen Latifah performed a mass wedding. I don't know if you saw it. And of course, many people were reminded of the Mooney religion. That's not their official name, it's the Unification Church. It's the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who's deceased now. He used to do these mass weddings. What I never realized was that, on purpose, these mass weddings were always, he tried to do them internationally. His religion was about getting people from Japan to marry people from Germany, and people from Sweden to marry people from Africa. He thought he was creating a kind of new realm of international peace. But he consciously styled himself after Alexander the Great. Because if you know your history of Alexander, when he conquered all these lands and he wanted to administer them, he would leave behind officers married to local women. So in those marriages, the wife would know the local language and the customs, and they could create not just a domination, because he really was seen as a liberator by many people from the Persians who were more despotic, but he could create a genuine fusion. So how history repeats, from Alexander to the Reverend, to that's why they call it the Unification Church, trying to unify the world, to Queen Latifah. It's, what can you do? We're stuck in history. This summer, I had this tremendous blessing to complement my many pilgrimages to Russia with a pilgrimage to early Christianity in Denmark and Sweden. And it wasn't something I expected, but I was invited by two friends who are writing a book about early Christianity in Sweden and Denmark. So off I went, and that was a big blessing, and I've told many of you some of the things I learned, and I'm going to amplify that here. The most interesting thing for me was to discover the important influence of Sweden on the history of Russia and the history of Orthodoxy in Russia, which I never would have guessed. I've never given this talk before, right, Father? I've never talked about that? Okay, good. So let's start with the history of Russian Orthodoxy. Unlike the history of the Russian people, which is kind of shrouded in mist, partly because the Russian people have always been many different ethnicities in one place coming together around a common language and political rule. So the history of the Russian people is kind of shrouded in mist, but the history of Russian Orthodoxy is a little more clear. We'll start with Saint Olga, who was baptized by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, so-called Constantine Porphyrogenitus. He wore the purple. I don't know why it's called that, but the purple is for the royal. The sources say she was baptized either in the year 945 or in the year 957. And the chronicles that give the two dates are both so precise that probably what it means is she came to Constantinople in 945 and was baptized and returned to the city in 957 on another embassy. She ruled the Kievan kingdom from the year 945 to the year 962 AD. So either from about the time she was baptized, or maybe she was already ruling and then got baptized, depending on the dates. She succeeded her husband, Igor I, who ruled from 912 to 945. Her husband, or at least she, had attempted to ally the Rus people more formally with the Byzantines and with Christianity. A treaty of 944 records this alliance. But there was some delay in the Byzantine emissaries coming to Kiev to baptize the people, and when they got there, they found that the political winds had shifted. Opposition from the Varangians, who we'll hear more about soon, and the Khazar Jews made the baptism of Kievan Rus impossible. The Varangians were pagans, and in at least some parts of their realms, the Varangians practiced even human sacrifice. So it was a tough crowd. In fact, King Igor, because he was, perhaps for this reason, he was flirting with Christianity, he was murdered by pagan opponents. And Saint Olga, although she's a saint of the church and her relics were even incorrupt, she was absolutely violent in her response to her husband's murder. To consolidate the realm, she, through a series of ruses, Rus, R-U-S-E, through a series of tricks, she deceived her husband's political opponents and had them all murdered. And by the hundreds, and the survivors got sold into slavery. Her son was only 3 years old. The pagans tried to force her to remarry, but during her rule from 945 to 962, she refused to remarry, waiting for her son to reach age of majority and take over the kingdom. He, however, refused to embrace Christianity, and he preferred paganism. But on the other hand, he did manage to unite the Rus people under the Kievan throne. So in a sense, he's the founder of a unified Russian nation. Before that, the Russian people had been involved in various principalities and city-states. The Kievan land was known to the pagans as the land of cities, so they had some kind of a trade and commerce emerging there. Most of these princes were Varangians, and the Varangians is the Byzantine name, and I guess because it was also an early roost name for the Swedes. So Russia was really ruled by Swedish princes, and its trade was dominated by Swedish merchant colonies. So I'm really interested about these Swedes. Now, let's just get our introduction over with, though. Saint Olga, as I said, who was baptized in maybe 945, and she died in 962. She did not succeed in Christianizing the Russian people, the Kievan kingdom. Her son rejected Christianity. He had great military plans which did not work, and his son, Vladimir the Great, is the Saint Vladimir that the St. Vladimir Seminary is named after. So it's Olga's grandson who also accepts baptism, although his father did not, and has to also fight the pagans, and in 988 orders his people and his noblemen baptized. And that really inaugurates the era of Russian Orthodoxy. The year 988 is the era that we get, even though you could say 945 with Olga, or earlier, as we shall see. So Vladimir in 988, he begins to baptize his kingdom, and we celebrated the 1000th anniversary of that in 1988. And that all takes place in Kiev. And was a great celebration, a millennial celebration. And thank God, Russia soon thereafter was liberated from communism. So Russia received directly from the Greek-speaking Roman Orthodox, people we call Byzantines, the pure faith of Christ. Vladimir ruled until 1015, so technically his entire reign is part of the great undivided church of the 5 patriarchates, right? It's a pre-schism. And he was succeeded by his son, Yaroslav the Wise. Under Yaroslav, Kiev reaches its biggest power, and a lot of good work gets done in terms of Christianizing the country and civilizing the country. That's why he's called the Wise. I suspect that he's also called he might be called the Wise because he learned Greek or something like that. Because with the Christianization of Kiev came lots and lots of court officials from Byzantium to help get things going. I think it's another 500 years really that they're still getting the Metropolitan of Kiev from Constantinople. It's many centuries before. Right, we've been here for 100 years and we're agitating, but the Russians took their time. Yaroslav, yes.
Is Russia during this period the same geographic coverage that we know it today?
No, it's mostly more like the Ukraine, and that's why we wanted to start with these pictures. Maybe when we finish this first page, we'll do the pictures because we want to show this is Kiev, right? But this is where it all started, and we'll talk about what's going on there.
So how far east did Russia extend?
At that time?
Yeah. Was it encompassed? Did it get into Asia as we know it? Or?
No. It's like the northern shores of the Black Sea, or even north of that, like not really reaching the Black Sea, and maybe as far east as the Volga. So well within European Russia. And keep in mind, there isn't, in a sense, a Russian people in a way. There's a Slavic language is evolving that will become Russian. But the members of that identity are from German lands and Swedish lands and Slavic peoples and even Turkic peoples. Many peoples are coming into it. Although historians now think that this is the way lots of people were. Like when Attila the Hun came through, basically, if your party was conquering everything, I mean, imagine how poor people were in those days. So all kinds of men would just join your army. All kinds of people would become hangers-on, trading with you, and your numbers would grow. And in theory, there's 300,000 Huns. But with the death of Attila, this is 500, so this is much earlier than this period. That all just goes away. It doesn't last. So national identity is much more fluid in those days. So just to continue the early history from Olga to her son to Vladimir, the grandson, to his son, Yaroslav. Yaroslav married a woman 25 years his junior. She was 16 or 17, the future Saint Anna of Novgorod. But her name at birth was Ingegard, Olaf's daughter. And as her name suggests, she was a Swedish princess. In fact, she was baptized at Huseby, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, Huseby maybe, so the Z, together with her entire family, her father. Her father Olaf was the first Christian king of Sweden in about 1000 something. Or maybe it's a little earlier, I'm not sure the exact date there, although I should know it because this summer I went to Huseby and I had that intense blessing of making that pilgrimage, and you drink water from the holy spring where the Swedish royal family first received the Christian faith. So she's, I think, about 8 years old when she's baptized, and as part of the alliance, because it's the Swedes who really are ruling Russia, and Vladimir and his mother and grandmother are descended from these Swedish Viking rulers. She's married into this Kievan dynasty. And she also is very wise, and together they're co-rulers of this kingdom, and that's why Kiev becomes so powerful. You can see it. You can see that. You know, if you want to Google something, just Google a map of Russia 1000 AD or something, and you'll get it. So Yaroslav and Ingegard, she took the name Irene. I think it's because she fell into the clutches of these Byzantine, pedagogues and stuff, and they couldn't say Ingegard, so they made her Irene. And she and her husband, not only they do a lot of great things, but they also had 10 children, including 4 daughters. And the 4 daughters became the queens, I couldn't believe this, but it is true, of Norway, Hungary, France, and possibly England. So you see, by the year 1000, what's developing, because the Swedes and the Danes and the Norwegians are Christianizing just before the Russians. So about the same time, that sort of Viking realm, which you have to include Russia in at that point, is coming to Christ. And what emerges is the beginning of a kind of pan-European Christian nobility, so that the whole continent is like one family. It's so amazing because you can't even imagine they could even travel in those days. I mean, I can barely, come from Brookline to Lexington without, So it's really, I really do want to focus a little bit at the beginning about the role of the Swedes, who are kind of, as we shall see, they're the godparents of Orthodoxy, of Christianity in Russia. And from the year 700 to the year 1700, the involvement of the Swedes in Russia is decisive for the reception of Orthodoxy. And in fact, actually, it lingers today. There's 3 phases. Did you didn't find there was not a good one or other?
Really good. Keep looking, but I feel like I'm distracting everyone.
Oh, that's okay. But maybe just click a bad one and we'll just point at it at least. That looks great. I think that might be sort of natural. Yeah, okay, that's good. Can we centralize that? So in theory, well, it's hard to really see. It's hard to really see. Maybe the yellow. See, it's not quite the Black Sea where the yellow is, but it's further north. And then there's just a tremendous amount of trade and communication between Sweden and Russia. So let's go to these 3 phases of Swedish influence in Russia and how it affects the Russian Orthodox Church. Even the name Russia comes from a Swedish word, in fact a Swedish province that's north of Stockholm. And it was brought to Russia by Rurik. The story goes in the Russian chronicles that the Vikings had ruled the Russians, or the people in what is Russia, for centuries, and a constellation of these peoples, because they weren't one people, rose up and threw them out. Then they proceeded to fight each other, and things fell apart, and so they sort of sent away to the Swedes again to come back and take over. And Rurik, a Swedish nobleman, a Viking, came and he established this dynasty. He's the father-in-law of Saint Olga. So Rurik is the father-in-law of Saint Olga, and the great-grandfather of Saint Vladimir. So that's how much. Saint Vladimir, wow, this great Russian princess. He's really a kind of a Viking, and he's comes directly from this Swedish lineage. Rurik lived in 830 to 879, and in 862 he comes to Kiev or Novgorod, wherever it is. As I said, in Constantinople they didn't call them Vikings, they called them Varangians. And they knew that the Varangian lords had ruled that part of what is now Russia. All the regions around the Baltic Sea were at one time known by the name of the Swedish province, for trade and settlement seems to have been mutual. So when you look at the Baltic, you can see where Stockholm is, and at one point Finland was ruled by the Swedes. The Finnish people were more small, but they were all the way down to the Black Sea, because in a sense they cut their teeth as seafarers on the safer realm of the rivers and lakes. There's so many rivers in Russia, all that internal commerce on rivers. There's even an old Russian legend that the Varangian or Viking involvement in Russia goes back to the time of Christ. Because the Russian legend is that St. Andrew did come to Kiev. Now, the Byzantines also thought in their history that Andrew had drawn lots and he received Scythia. And Scythia are these steppes above the Black Sea. So our patriarchate believes that he went there, and on his way he stopped in Constantinople. That's Constantinople's claim to apostolic foundation, because he left Stachys as the first bishop there. Stachys is the name. And the Russian legend is that he came with the Varangian sea route, the trade routes, that the Varangians were already crossing the Black Sea by the time of Christ, 700 years earlier than anyone else thinks they were, but in any case, who really knows? And that St. Andrew, found one of these Varangian ships and said, hey, where are you going? And took it. So that's another fascinating thing, that Swedish influence was so decisive, even to the visit of the apostle. So, at least by the 700s, we have the Swedes running ships and trade from Constantinople, from down in Constantinople, across the Black Sea, all the way across the rivers of Russia to the Baltic, and perhaps much earlier. And a constellation of the Vikings, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danes, would later discover and populate Iceland in the late 800s. So I don't think Iceland's even on the map, right? Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland. He lived 950 to 1003, and he discovered Greenland. And soon after that, the Vikings reached Canada. So I'm just loving the Vikings. They're all the way from Canada to Constantinople. They're great. In 986, this is the Canadian expedition, Leif Erikson, a guy whose name I can't even pronounce. I think I have it here, let me find it. Thorfinn Karlsefni. Karlsefni means great man. I don't know what Thorfinn means. And a third person, they're the ones who reached Canada on the first Viking expedition. We probably learned in elementary school about the settlement in Vinland. It's in Upper Newfoundland. This peninsula, this settlement has been found and excavated in the last 50 years. We know and other Viking settlements in Canada have been found. So these people got around. But they had a lot of conflict with the even fiercer local people, who were even fiercer than the Vikings. And they were eventually driven out, and there were also some internal dissension. But these archaeological remains are the earliest evidence of European settlement in North America, and they're the only confirmed European contact with the New World before Columbus is these Viking settlements. So that was 1,000 years ago. They took three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa. Just kidding. They took 3 ships and they set off from the west coast of Greenland. And And they had a motley crew of Scots and Irish and everyone else, and everyone was dressed in their very primitive clothing, and the Icelandic chronicles record all this, and how people looked, and some of them were just, I mean, you can imagine, talk about like mountain man or survival people, and so they would just set them loose, you know. In the saga, one of the guys is a hunter, and they're starving, so they let him go. He goes missing, and 6 days later they find him passed out on the top of a rock. And they say, you know, what were you doing? And he just, this is the saga, and he says, I cannot tell anyone the nature of it. And they found a whale, and they killed the whale, and all got sick. Anyway, there's a lot of stories there, but these were the people. At this settlement in Finland was born, because these people were also seem to have been Christianized, at least the saga, maybe it's anachronistic, but it thinks they were. So the first Christian baby in the New World is born, and his name is Snorri, S-N-O-R-R-I. So I'm encouraging all my married students at Holy Cross to have an extra child and name him Snorri in honor of the first Orthodox baby in New World. Anyway, this is all, of course, pre-schism, so the church is one. So here are the Vikings, as I said, traveling from Canada to Constantinople by the year 1000 AD. And I wrote in my notes, I really need to get out more. In fact, the influence of the Vikings is even stronger. They conquered the part of France that would later become Normandy, and they settled there. They didn't just conquer, they settled it. And then the Normans became, by 1066, the most powerful people north of the Alps, the most well-organized and brilliant administrators and architects. And in 1066, of course, they conquered England. So the Vikings are just all over the place. Oh, wow. That's great.
Yeah, France.
Yeah, they founded, well, there's some disagreement, but that the Vikings may have founded Dublin, the modern city of Dublin. So no, there was something there already, but in Copenhagen, there's a beautiful Viking ship museum that we went to this summer, and they're so smart nowadays, scientists. You know, they can find out where the wood came from for each ship, so they know that one of them was built in Dublin, and they just have all these details, and they've reconstructed the ships. Are just they're long, they're big. Most of them are there. So they had that great flowering, and for us, the most significant part of it is their influence on uniting the Rus with Byzantium. I wanted to insert here something that I read 5 years ago, that they did a study of marriage records in Europe, a very careful study, and they went sort of north, south, east, and west, trying to figure out how interrelated the peoples of Europe are. And they came up with this interesting statistic, that if you go back 800 years, let's say you're of European ancestry, if you go back 800 years in European history, before that time, anyone you read about, anyone, is in your direct ancestry. Now, it's not equally weighted, right? Because otherwise we would all look exactly the same, right? But it is, that's it. It's 800 years, and then that's like the cutoff. I mean, we sort of go back into that general pool, right? Because we all have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and the number just goes. And then they just were surprised that even in the medieval period, there'd been so much traveling around Europe. So it really did happen, and we see that with Ingegard. And, one of my favorite details is that in Hagia Sophia in the 900s, already the Vikings left graffiti in the old, what's the old Viking script, the runic, the R-U-N-I-C, the runic alphabet. It's on the second floor on the balustrade. They were guarding the Empress. Someone with a Viking axe he cut in. It just says Harold was here. So that there is this tremendous, we just don't think about that. The world has always been like that in a way. People get around, and we're all interrelated in our past and our histories. Now, by 839, there's a more, so we're starting, sort of back at 839, there's a more developed contact between the Byzantines and the Russians / Vikings. And in 860, the Byzantines have territory north of the Black Sea, so they have stuff over there, and they're encroaching on the Russian Viking land. So in 860, the Russians, led by their Viking noble leaders, attacked Constantinople with a force of 200 boats. The emperor was away at that time fighting the Arabs in Anatolia. The city was utterly defenseless, and the patriarch, the great Saint Photius, who sent the first missionaries to the Slavs, he was there. He records what happened. So these Viking Russians went to the island of Halki and all the Princess Islands, and they slaughtered all kinds of churchmen and monastics and everything, and very, very fiercely wreaked revenge. The earliest written mention of the word Rus is actually by Photius himself. And that figures because the Byzantines were great anthropologists. They didn't want to fight. They knew that was very dangerous. And so they developed a very big intelligence service, and they studied all the peoples of the world very carefully, tried to learn their customs and language and figure out what's going on all the time. So there are many peoples in the world who the first recorded mention of them is in the Byzantine Chronicles. I mentioned this during the war talk. So Photius himself is the first to write the word Rus, and they knew who these people were now. These attacks did not lead to victory. The history of the church says that, in fact, the patriarch himself led prayers to the Mother of God, and she sent a storm into the sea off Constantinople and destroyed the Russian fleet. So that was the first meeting, first big meeting, and that's how it ended. But a peace treaty followed, and one of the conditions of the treaty, or soon thereafter, was that any Varangian, any Viking who reached Constantinople, was welcome to serve in the personal bodyguard of the emperor. So this is true throughout history, that leaders will try to get foreigners to be their personal guard, so they're loyal only to them. They have no other friends in the place. So the Vikings guarded the Byzantine emperor from that time until 1453. And the Varangian guard was large and fought well. And the honor of Constantinople passed throughout the Russian realms and into Stockholm and Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and many Vikings had the dream of someday going to what they called Miklagard, the great city, to serve for the emperor for a few years and leave with gold. And all these guys had to get baptized Orthodox as the condition of their service. This is the kind of the first Christianization of the Swedes and the Vikings, was these people. Now they didn't dare to impose Christianity back in Sweden because human sacrifice was the order of the day, and they didn't want to be the next offering. But they did establish the first churches. Before the Christianization of Russia, already they're establishing churches. And even Photius says, how did they know how to get here? Because already somehow there were Christians in the Russian lands who were making pilgrimages to Constantinople. So it's a little bit shrouded, but already some of these Varangian noblemen are already having churches, but it doesn't really penetrate because they're the sort of overlords. It's personal to them. They were nobles either as the rulers or they were nobles as traders. And as I said about this famous graffiti, you can find it on the web if you look for Viking graffiti, Hagia Sophia. And what happened too is that then, and this is how things